"Don't drink that, you are being poisoned," whispered the waitress, not knowing he was the most feared mafia boss in the country. Each like and comment helps heart pulses touch even more hearts. Join us for the next story. The city lights twinkled below like fallen stars, creating a golden carpet that stretched to the horizon. Samantha balanced the tray with precision as she walked between the tables of the most exclusive rooftop restaurant, where men in expensive suits decided the fate of fortunes. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from the weight of the tray, but from the constant pressure of knowing that a single drop of wine on the wrong tie could cost her job. That night's salary would pay for another month of medical school, a dream that seemed too distant for a girl who grew up counting coins. "One more night and I'll be closer," she murmured to herself, forcing a professional smile. The private hall was filled with deep voices discussing business in low tones, but Samantha had learned the art of being invisible among the powerful. She collected empty glasses and served drinks without any of the men even raising their eyes to her, as if she were just another piece of the luxurious decor. That was exactly how she preferred it, to go unnoticed, do her job and return home with the money that would bring her closer to her degree. But when her eyes met a man sitting alone near the panoramic window, something inside her stirred inexplicably. Why does he seem so alone among so many people? Alexander observed the city through the glass with the same coldness with which he conducted his business, fingers silently drumming on the mahogany table. His dark eyes reflected the nightlights, but nothing of what he felt inside showed on his angular and perfectly controlled face. He was accustomed to meetings like this, where ambitious men tried to impress him with proposals that rarely sparked his interest. The business world was predictable, filled with people who wanted something from him without offering anything of real value in return. "Everyone wants a slice of what I built, but none of them understand the price I paid for it." Samantha approached his table with calculated steps, noticing how he maintained impeccable posture, even when alone, as if each gesture was part of a rehearsed performance. There was something magnetic about the way he occupied the space around him, a presence that seemed to suck all the air from the room, without him needing to speak a single word. When she leaned in to collect the empty glass beside him, she noticed the masculine and sophisticated perfume that emanated from his skin, a fragrance that matched the natural elegance of his movements. Her fingers briefly brushed the table, and she felt a shiver run down her spine when he turned his face toward her. My eyes shouldn't be seeking his. It was then that Samantha noticed the suspicious movement at the next table, where a grey-bearded man discreetly dropped something small and crystalline into the whiskey glass that would be served to Alexander. The object dissolved quickly in the amber liquid, disappearing without leaving visible traces, but Samantha had clearly seen the furtive gesture. Her heart raced when she realized she was witnessing something that could be fatal, and her medical mind immediately recognized the signs of poisoning in progress. She looked at Alexander, who remained unaware of the danger, his long, elegant fingers drumming on the table while observing the city. If I do nothing, he could die tonight. Fear froze her veins, but the instinct to save lives spoke louder than any rational caution she might have. Samantha approached Alexander's table with her heart beating erratically, pretending to adjust the utensils, while leaning in enough so that only he could hear her. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the napkins, trying to appear natural, while preparing to pronounce the words that would change everything between them. His perfume invaded her senses again, and she had to fight against the distraction to focus on what really mattered at that moment. "Don't drink that. You're being poisoned," she whispered near his ear, her voice low but loaded with urgency. Alexander slowly turned his face toward her, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her momentarily forget how to breathe. There was surprise in his gaze, but also a dangerous curiosity that made her realize she had crossed a line from which she could not return. He didn't show shock or desperation as she expected. Instead, his eyes studied her with the precision of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities in a matter of seconds. The silence between them extended for a few moments, charged with electricity, as Samantha tried to decipher if she had done the right thing. "Why would you do that?" he asked in a low, controlled tone, without taking his eyes from her face. Samantha felt her legs tremble under the weight of that penetrating gaze, but remained firm, even feeling that she had just gotten herself into something much bigger than she could imagine. She discreetly pointed to the table next to them, where the man with a graying beard was trying to appear disinterested while observing the interaction between them. Alexander followed her gaze with calculated movements, and Samantha could see the exact moment when he understood the situation, a subtle change in his expression that revealed a sharp and dangerous intelligence. When he looked back at her, there was something different in his eyes, an intensity that made her question whether she had saved his life or sealed her own fate. "Because it was the right thing to do," she answered, trying to sound braver than she actually felt. With fluid and seemingly casual movements, Alexander pushed the whiskey glass away from him, pretending to be more interested in the conversation with Samantha than in the drink. He discreetly observed the reactions of the men around, especially of the suspect Samantha had indicated, noticing subtle signs of nervousness that confirmed his suspicions. His analytical mind was already processing the implications of that poisoning attempt, evaluating who might be behind it and what next moves would be necessary. But a part of him, a part he rarely allowed to surface, was focused on the brave woman in front of him who had risked everything to save him. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" he asked, a mixture of admiration and concern tinging his deep voice. Samantha shook her head negatively, realizing for the first time that she really knew nothing about the man she had just saved. There was something in the way he spoke, in the way he occupied the space around him, that suggested power and influence far beyond what he appeared to have. Her eyes quickly scanned his face, noticing the almost imperceptible scar near his left temple, and the way his fingers moved with military precision across the table. Fear began to mix with curiosity when she realized that the other men in the room were watching him with a reverence that went beyond simple professional respect. "Should I?" she asked, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. An almost imperceptible smile touched Alexander's lips, an expression that didn't reach his eyes but completely transformed his physiognomy for a few seconds. He leaned slightly towards her, creating a bubble of intimacy amidst the room full of people, and Samantha could feel the heat emanating from his body even through the impeccable fabric of his suit. There was something hypnotic about the way he observed her, as if he were trying to decipher a complex enigma that she represented to him. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a dangerous softness that made her realize she was dealing with someone much more complex than she had imagined. "Perhaps it's better that you don't," he said, but there was something in his eyes that suggested exactly the opposite. The tension in the air between them was almost palpable, creating an invisible connection that Samantha couldn't fully comprehend, but also couldn't ignore. She knew she should step away, get back to work and forget everything that had happened, but her feet seemed glued to the floor as she lost herself in the depth of those dark eyes. There was danger there. She could feel it in every fiber of her being, but there was also something else, something that attracted her in an inexplicable way. The man before her radiated a magnetism that defied all logic and caution she was trying to maintain. "I should go," she murmured, but her voice carried no conviction. Alexander observed the other men in the room with a look that revealed nothing of his intentions, but Samantha could perceive the subtle change in his posture, as if he were preparing for something. He rose from the chair with elegant and controlled movements, and Samantha realized how imposing he was, his presence dominating the space around even without making any apparent effort. When he passed by her, their bodies almost touched, and she felt a wave of heat course through her skin where the fabric of his suit lightly brushed against her arm. For a moment he stopped right beside her, so close that she could feel his breath near her ear. "Thank you," he said in a tone so low that only she could hear. Samantha stood still in place, watching as Alexander walked towards the exit of the private salon with firm and determined steps. He didn't look back even once, but she had the strange sensation that he was completely aware of every movement she made, as if he possessed a keen perception that went beyond normal senses. The other men in the room greeted him with reverence as he passed, and Samantha noticed whispers and glances that confirmed her suspicions that she had just interacted with someone very powerful. Her hands were still trembling slightly as she tried to process everything that had happened in the last few minutes. He had left without explanations, without answers, but he had left something far more disturbing behind. The night continued its natural course, but Samantha couldn't fully concentrate on her work for the rest of her shift. Each time she passed the place where Alexander had been sitting, she felt a strange nostalgia, as if an important part of the room had been removed along with him. The other men eventually left too, but none of them had caused the same impact on her mind and heart. When it finally came time to leave, Samantha gathered her things with automatic movements, her mind still processing every word, every look, every second of that unexpected interaction. She knew she had saved a stranger's life, but couldn't shake the feeling that it was she who had been transformed in that encounter. He turned his back and left without a word, but she still felt the weight of that gaze engraved in her soul. 3 weeks had passed since that night at the restaurant, but Samantha still felt a shiver run down her spine every time she recalled the penetrating gaze of that mysterious man. She tried to convince herself that it had been just a casual encounter, a good deed that any decent person would do, but she couldn't forget the intensity of those dark eyes or the way his deep voice had echoed in her ears. When she arrived home that afternoon and found a letter from college informing her that her debt had been paid in full by an anonymous benefactor, her heart raced with a suspicion she didn't want to admit. This can't be a coincidence. The second surprise came the next day, when an elegant lawyer appeared at her door with documents for an apartment that had been placed at her disposal, at no cost, for an indefinite period. Samantha observed the place with suspicious eyes, noticing every detail of the sophisticated decoration, expensive furniture, and the stunning view of the city that stretched through the panoramic windows. It was exactly the type of place she dreamed of living in someday, when she finished college and got a job that paid enough for a dignified life. But receiving all of this as a gift made her feel like a doll in a dollhouse too expensive for her. Nothing in life is free, and I am not a charity. Samantha spent the first days in the new apartment in a constant state of alertness, expecting someone to appear to collect the favor or reveal the true intentions behind such generosity. She kept her clothes in a small suitcase, ready to leave at any moment, and avoided getting too used to the comfort that now surrounded her. Each morning, waking up in the extra-large bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, she reminded herself that this wasn't really hers, that it was just a temporary illusion that could disappear as quickly as it had arrived. The sensation of living someone else's life accompanied her throughout the day, creating a constant tension in her shoulders. I don't belong in this place. It was in the third week when Samantha finally began to lower her guard and admit that perhaps she could enjoy this unexpected gift, that she arrived home after a long shift at the hospital and found a familiar silhouette on the veranda. Alexander was sitting in one of the wicker armchairs, observing the city lights with the same elegant and controlled posture she remembered from that night at the restaurant. He wore a dark suit that perfectly molded to his athletic body, and his hair was impeccably combed, as if he had just left an important meeting moments before. Samantha's heart raced upon seeing him, a mixture of relief and anxiety taking over her chest. "So you're my mysterious benefactor?" Alexander turned slowly when he heard the door close, his eyes meeting hers with the same intensity she recalled. But now there was something more there, a cold determination that made her realize that this conversation would be different from anything she could imagine. He rose from the armchair with fluid movements and approached her with measured steps, maintaining a respectful distance but still making Samantha feel small before his imposing presence. There was a contained energy in him, as if he were making an effort to keep something under control, and Samantha noticed that his fists were slightly clenched at his sides. When he spoke, his voice carried the same controlled coldness as before, but there was an underlying urgency she couldn't ignore. "We need to talk." Samantha let her purse drop on the sofa and crossed her arms over her chest, trying to create a physical barrier between herself and the intensity emanating from Alexander like heat waves. She had imagined this moment dozens of times during the past weeks, mentally rehearsing what she would say if he appeared, but now that he was there, in flesh and blood, all words seemed to have evaporated from her mind. There was something dangerously attractive about the way he occupied the space of the room, as if the entire apartment had been designed to accommodate him, and Samantha had to struggle to keep focused on the conversation instead of getting lost in the contemplation of his magnetic presence. "You bought all this for me without even knowing my full name?" Alexander's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, an expression that Samantha was beginning to recognize as his way of maintaining emotional distance even during the most intimate interactions. He walked to the window and rested one hand on the glass, observing the city below with a thoughtful expression that revealed layers of complexity that Samantha was only beginning to perceive. There was a profound loneliness in the way he positioned himself, as if he was accustomed to facing the world alone, and had built walls so high around his heart that not even he knew how to tear them down anymore. When he looked at her again, his eyes carried a seriousness that made her stomach tighten with nervousness. Samantha Williams, 24 years old, fifth-year medical student, orphaned since 16. The shock of hearing her personal history recited with such precision made Samantha step back, her mind trying to process the fact that he had investigated her entire life without her knowing. There was an invasion of privacy there that should have made her furious, but what really disturbed her was the gentle way he had pronounced her name, as if it were something precious that he had kept in his memory during all those weeks. She wondered how much other information about her life he possessed, how many intimate details had been exposed to this man who remained a complete mystery to her. The vulnerability of being completely known by someone she knew nothing about made her feel naked and unprotected. "What else do you know about me?" Alexander ignored her question and continued speaking with the same controlled voice. But Samantha could perceive a growing tension in his shoulders, suggesting that this conversation was as difficult for him as it was for her. He explained that dangerous men might come after her due to what she had witnessed that night at the restaurant, that her life was at risk simply for doing the right thing, and that the only way to ensure her safety was to keep her under his protection. The words came out of his mouth mechanically, as if he had rehearsed that speech several times, but Samantha could see the internal struggle unfolding behind his dark eyes. It was as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her that this was purely a matter of security. "You have no choice in this matter." Anger rose in Samantha's chest like hot lava, an emotion she rarely allowed to dominate her, but which now seemed to be the only appropriate response to the absurd situation she found herself in. She approached him with firm steps, her eyes sparkling with a determination that made Alexander slightly back away, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something like surprise in his controlled expression. There was something liberating in confronting him, in breaking that unbalanced power dynamic he had established between them from the first moment. And Samantha felt a current of energy course through her body when she realized that her words had made an impact. "I have always had choices, and I won't stop having them now just because a stranger decided to play protector." Alexander observed her with renewed intensity, as if he were seeing a facet of her that he hadn't expected to find, and Samantha could swear she saw a flash of admiration pass through his eyes before he regained his usual composure. He took a few steps toward her, reducing the space between them until Samantha could feel the heat emanating from his body and the masculine perfume she had unconsciously memorized since their first encounter. There was something hypnotic about the way he observed her, as if he were trying to decipher a complex puzzle that she represented to him, and Samantha felt her determination slightly waver under the weight of that penetrating gaze. When he spoke again, his voice was a few tones lower, carrying a dangerous intimacy that made her heart race. "You underestimate the danger you are in." The days that followed this conversation established a strange and tense routine in the apartment that Samantha now knew belonged to Alexander. She woke up every morning with a cup of fresh coffee waiting for her in the kitchen, prepared exactly the way she liked it, with a pinch of cinnamon and 2 spoonfuls of sugar, details he had discovered by observing her during previous mornings. He was never present when she woke up, but there were subtle signs of his presence everywhere, a magazine folded in the exact way he had left it, the almost imperceptible smell of his cologne in the air, the feeling that someone had been there moments before. It was like living with a benevolent ghost who took care of every detail of her life without ever fully revealing himself. How can he be so present without ever really being here? Samantha tried to maintain her normal routine, going to classes and hospital shifts as if nothing had changed, but she couldn't ignore Alexander's constant presence in her life, even when he wasn't physically there. She noticed men in suits in dark cars parked near wherever she was, discreet figures who followed her at a distance, but never got close enough to be a threat or a nuisance. There was an invisible protection network around her that worked with military precision, and Samantha found herself wondering how many people were involved in that elaborate security scheme. The feeling of being constantly watched should have bothered her, but instead she felt strangely safe, as if nothing bad could happen while she was under that silent protection. Does he really care, or is it just wounded pride? Direct interactions between them were rare, and always charged with an electric tension that left Samantha restless for hours after he departed. Alexander would appear in the apartment at unexpected moments, always with a practical excuse to be there, checking the security system, delivering important documents, or simply ensuring she was okay. But Samantha noticed the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way he found excuses to prolong conversations, even when it was obvious he should be somewhere else. There was a constant struggle happening behind his controlled facade, a battle between the duty he had assumed and something much more personal that he clearly didn't want to admit. Why do you fight so hard against yourself? One night, as Samantha was studying at the living room table immersed in anatomy books and class notes, she felt that familiar sensation of being watched that had become part of her new routine. She looked up from her books and scanned the room, searching for signs of Alexander's presence, but found nothing beyond the shadows cast by the city lights through the windows. There was something comforting about that constant surveillance that she didn't want to admit, a sense of security that went beyond physical protection and touched on emotional needs she had learned to suppress since becoming an orphan. She returned to focusing on her studies, but part of her mind remained attuned to the sounds of the apartment, waiting for some sign that he was nearby. When did I start missing your presence? It was during one of these solitary study nights that Samantha finally decided to confront the situation directly, tired of living in that constant state of tension and expectation. She closed her books with more force than necessary and walked to the kitchen to prepare some tea, her movements intentionally noisy, as if trying to provoke a reaction from any invisible observer who might be present. The silence of the apartment enveloped her like a shroud, but she knew with a certainty she couldn't rationally explain that she wasn't alone in that space. There was a specific energy in the air that she had learned to associate with Alexander's presence, an almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere that her body had become sensitive to detecting. "I know you're there." Samantha finished preparing the tea and stood in the kitchen for a few minutes, waiting for a response that didn't come, but feeling the tension in the air intensify, as if her words had been heard and understood. She took the steaming cup to the living room and settled on the couch, positioning herself so she could observe all the entrances to the apartment without appearing to be doing so intentionally. The hot tea warmed her hands and chest, but couldn't dispel the restlessness that had settled in her heart since Alexander entered her life so abruptly and transformatively. There was something deeply lonely about living in that constant state of almost meeting, almost conversing, almost revealing. "How many nights have you spent watching me without my knowledge?" The answer came unexpectedly when Samantha stood up to take the empty cup back to the kitchen and turned to discover Alexander standing in the entrance of the living room, observing her with an intensity that made the air seem denser around them. He was leaning on the doorframe with an apparently casual posture, but Samantha could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his fingers curved slightly, as if he were preparing to flee at any moment. There was something vulnerable about being caught in his silent vigilance, a crack in his armor of control that made him seem more human and accessible than she had ever seen him. His eyes traveled over her face with a visual hunger he didn't try to hide, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of her expression. She turned and found him standing at the door, watching, as if memorizing every detail of her. The navy blue dress that Alexander had personally chosen for Samantha fit her body like a second skin, highlighting every curve elegantly without being vulgar. She observed herself in the bedroom mirror for the 10th time that night, trying to recognize the sophisticated woman staring back at her, with her hair in an elegant bun that left her neck exposed and small diamond earrings that sparkled under the soft light. There was something transformative about wearing such expensive and well-cut clothes, as if she could pretend to belong to that world of luxury and power for a few hours. But beneath all that borrowed elegance, Her heart beat erratically at the prospect of spending an entire evening alongside Alexander in public. Does he see me differently now, or am I still just a problem to be solved? Alexander was waiting for her in the living room, wearing an impeccable tuxedo that further emphasized his imposing posture and the breadth of his shoulders. When Samantha descended the stairs and his eyes met hers, she could see a subtle change in his expression, a flash of something that seemed like admiration before he regained his usual composure. He approached her with measured steps, and Samantha felt his magnetic presence envelop her, as it always happened when he was nearby, a sensation that made her feel simultaneously protected and vulnerable. When he extended his arm to her, his fingers briefly brushed against the exposed skin of her wrist, sending an electric current throughout her body. "You look beautiful," he said, in a low tone that carried a sincerity she rarely heard from his lips. The charity gala hall was a work of art in crystal and gold, with enormous chandeliers that projected colored reflections on the mirrored walls and white flowers arranged with artistic perfection. Samantha felt small amid such opulence, but Alexander's firm presence beside her reassured her, even when she noticed the curious and sometimes envious glances from other women present. He guided her through the crowd with the confidence of someone who knew that environment like the back of his hand, greeting important people with polite nods, but always maintaining a protective hand on Samantha's back. There was something possessive about the way he introduced her to people, as if he were marking territory in a subtle but unequivocal manner. "Everyone here knows exactly who you are, don't they?" During the first hour of the event, Alexander remained constantly by Samantha's side, engaged in business conversations that she pretended to follow while discreetly observing the social dynamics of that world so different from her own. She noticed how people behaved around him, the reverence disguised as cordiality, the care with which they chose their words, the way some avoided his direct gaze while others desperately tried to get his attention. There was an aura of power around Alexander that was almost palpable, and Samantha wondered once again exactly what she had gotten herself into that night at the restaurant. When he briefly stepped away to answer an urgent call, she found herself alone for the first time in weeks. "How many secrets do you still hide from me?" It was during this brief moment of solitude that the young doctor approached Samantha with a warm and genuine smile that contrasted drastically with the calculated coldness she had grown accustomed to seeing in Alexander's eyes. He presented himself as a cardiology specialist and immediately started an animated conversation about medicine, demonstrating impressive knowledge and contagious passion for his profession. Samantha found herself laughing for the first time in weeks, her eyes shining with enthusiasm as they discussed innovative surgical techniques and recent discoveries in the medical field. It was comforting to talk with someone who shared her professional dreams and ambitions, someone who saw her as a potential colleague instead of a problem to be protected. "It's so good to talk to someone who understands my passion." Across the hall, Alexander observed the interaction with a progressively tenser jaw, his fingers curving around the champagne glass until it almost broke in his hands. There was something primitive in the anger building in his chest as he watched Samantha smile at another man in a way she had never smiled at him, a genuine luminosity that completely transformed her face and made her look even more beautiful. He tried to focus on the business conversation happening around him, but his eyes kept drifting towards Samantha and the doctor, who was now gesturing animatedly while telling some story that clearly amused her greatly. The possessiveness he had tried to keep under control during all those weeks of silent protection threatened to explode within his chest. "She never laughed like that with me." When the doctor extended his hand to Samantha, inviting her to dance, Alexander felt something break inside his chest, a barrier he had carefully built to keep his feelings under control. He moved through the crowd with determined steps, his presence cutting conversations in half and making people instinctively move out of his way. There was a dangerous energy emanating from him that Samantha immediately noticed when he materialized beside them, his polite but icy smile directed at the doctor who still held her hand. The temperature around the small group seemed to drop a few degrees when Alexander spoke with a courtesy that didn't come close to reaching his dark eyes. "I'm afraid the lady already has a commitment for this dance." Samantha felt anger rise in her throat like bile when she realized what Alexander was doing, the way he had effectively marked territory over her without even consulting her wishes or preferences. The doctor, clearly uncomfortable with the palpable tension that had settled between them, muttered a polite apology and quickly moved away, leaving Samantha alone with Alexander and a fury she struggled to keep controlled. She could feel the curious glances of people around them, people who clearly knew Alexander's reputation and now speculated about her relationship with him. There was something humiliating about being treated as property in public, as if her opinions and desires had no relevance in the equation. "You have no right to control who I talk to." Alexander held Samantha's arm firmly, but without hurting her, guiding her through the crowd toward an isolated balcony that offered privacy for the conversation he knew was inevitable. He could feel the tension radiating from her body, the contained anger that threatened to explode at any moment, and part of him admired her strength and independence, even as he fought against the desire to protect her from everything and everyone who might represent a threat. The balcony was bathed in the soft light of the stars and the city lights below, creating a romantic atmosphere that contrasted drastically with the tension building between them. When he finally released her and turned to face her, Samantha could see the internal struggle unfolding behind his dark eyes. "You have no idea what you're doing to me." Samantha crossed her arms over her chest and faced Alexander with a fierce determination that made him step back slightly, surprised by the intensity of her reaction. She had grown tired of being treated like a fragile doll that needed to be protected from all of life's decisions and interactions, especially when those decisions were made by a man who refused to admit his true feelings. There was something liberating about confronting him directly, breaking the power dynamic he had established between them from day one, and Samantha felt a current of energy run through her body when she saw the genuine surprise in his expression. The dress he had chosen for her suddenly felt like armor, giving her the confidence needed to face his arrogance. "I am not your property, Alexander, and you cannot simply decide who does or doesn't have permission to talk to me." Alexander's mask of control began to crack under the pressure of Samantha's accusation, revealing glimpses of the emotional storm he had carefully kept hidden during all those weeks of silent protection. He approached her with measured steps, his dark eyes shining with an intensity that made her heart race, and Samantha could feel the heat emanating from his body, even through the fabric of his tuxedo. There was something primitive in the way he observed her, as if he was waging an internal battle between the need to maintain distance and the overwhelming desire to claim her as his own. When he spoke, his voice was several tones lower, carrying a raw emotion she had never heard before. "You're right, you're not my property, but that doesn't change the fact that I can't bear to see another man touching you." The unexpected confession left Samantha momentarily speechless, her heart beating so hard she was certain he could hear it in the quietness of the veranda. There was a raw vulnerability in Alexander's voice that contrasted drastically with the image of absolute control he always projected, and she realized that this was probably the most honest thing he had ever said to her. The anger she had felt moments before began to transform into something much more complex and dangerous, a mixture of understanding, compassion, and a desire she had tried to deny for weeks. She took a step toward him, further reducing the space between them, and could see the way his breathing changed when she approached. "Then stop fighting what you feel and tell me the truth." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather courage to do something that went against all his self-preservation instincts, and when he opened them again, Samantha saw an intensity that left her breathless. He raised one hand and gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contrasted with the strength she knew he possessed. There were years of solitude and emotional isolation in that touch, as if he was rediscovering what it meant to truly connect with another person after living behind emotional walls for so long. The confession that left his lips was almost a whisper, but carried the weight of weeks of repressed feelings. "The truth is that you've haunted me since that night at the restaurant, and I no longer know how to pretend this is just about protection." The kiss happened as if it were inevitable, a collision of repressed emotions and denied desires that finally found a form of expression. Alexander pressed his lips against hers with a desperate intensity, as if trying to convey through that contact everything he couldn't express in words. Samantha responded with equal fervor, her hands burying themselves in his hair while she savored the sensation of finally breaking all the barriers they had built between them. There were years of loneliness on both sides being healed in that moment, a deep connection that went far beyond physical attraction and touched on emotional needs that neither had admitted to possessing. For a few precious seconds, all of Alexander's coldness and control completely disappeared, leaving only the vulnerable man who hid behind the facade. This is how it should have been from the beginning. When they finally separated, the reality of what had happened fell on both of them like a bucket of cold water, bringing back all the complications and impossibilities they had tried to ignore. Alexander retreated first, his breathing uneven and his eyes carrying a mixture of desire and something that seemed almost like panic, as if he had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. Samantha touched her own lips, still feeling his taste and the promise of everything that could exist between them, if only he would stop fighting against his own feelings. There was a fundamental change in the air between them, as if that kiss had irrevocably altered the dynamic of their relationship. He pulled away first, breathing uneven, but the taste of promise remained on her lips. Samantha woke up the next morning with the taste of the kiss still on her lips and a dangerous hope blooming in her chest. But when she went down to the kitchen, she didn't find the fresh coffee usually waiting for her. The silence of the apartment seemed heavier than usual, loaded with an absence that she felt physically, as if an essential part of the atmosphere had been removed during the night. She prepared her own coffee with mechanical movements, trying to ignore how her hands trembled slightly while holding the cup, a reaction she attributed to caffeine but deeply knew had another origin. The memory of the intensity of the kiss on the balcony contrasted drastically with the emptiness that now filled every corner of the apartment. Maybe he just needs time to process what happened. The days that followed established a painful pattern of absence that slowly eroded the hope Samantha had nurtured after the night of the gala. Alexander no longer appeared at the apartment, not even for his usual security checks, and the only evidence of his presence were the men in suits who continued to observe her from a distance with the same professional discretion as always. When she tried to contact him through the numbers he had left for emergencies, her calls were answered by polite but inflexible security guards who simply said they would take messages that were never returned. There was something humiliating about being so systematically ignored by someone who had confessed he couldn't bear to see her near other men just days before. How can he simply pretend that nothing happened between us? In the office with a panoramic view of the city, Alexander tried to concentrate on the financial reports spread across his mahogany desk, but his eyes kept drifting to the window where he could see the building where Samantha lived. There was a constant war happening inside his chest, a battle between the overwhelming desire to go back to her and the rational certainty that she would be safer and happier away from his dangerous and complicated world. He had built that empire through cold and calculated decisions, sacrificing personal connections in the name of power and influence, but had never found someone who made him question if the price had been too high. The taste of her lips still haunted him in moments of silence, reminding him of a tenderness he had thought was lost forever. She deserves someone who can give her a normal life, not this labyrinth of dangers and secrets. When Samantha finally managed to confront him directly, appearing at the commercial building where his office was located, with a determination that impressed even the most experienced security guards, Alexander felt his carefully controlled world threatening to collapse. She was standing at the door of his office with eyes shining with contained tears and a righteous anger that made her seem even more beautiful in her indignation, and he had to fight against every instinct telling him to stand up and take her in his arms. There was hurt in every line of her body, a deep wound that he knew he had caused with his abrupt and unexplained withdrawal, but he forced his expression to remain cold and distant. When she asked why he had disappeared without explanations, her voice carrying a vulnerability that broke something inside him, Alexander felt he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. "You came here for a conversation that shouldn't be happening." Samantha entered the office uninvited, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary, and Alexander could feel the furious energy emanating from her like heat waves. She approached his desk with determined steps, her eyes never leaving his. and he realized he had underestimated her strength and determination when he decided to simply ignore her until she gave up. There was something majestic in her anger, a wounded dignity that made her look like a queen confronting an unfaithful subject. And Alexander felt reluctant admiration mixed with the constant desire he had tried to bury during the past few days. When she spoke, her voice was controlled but loaded with emotion, each word carefully chosen to cause maximum impact. "I thought what happened on the balcony meant something to you, but apparently I was wrong." Alexander slowly rose from his chair, moving toward the window to avoid looking directly at Samantha, knowing his resolution would falter if he saw the pain in her eyes for too long. He rested one hand on the cold glass and observed the city below, trying to find the words that would push her away definitively without completely destroying her in the process. There was a necessary cruelty in what he was about to do, a form of protection disguised as rejection that he hoped she might one day understand and perhaps even forgive. When he spoke again, he forced his voice to sound as cold and indifferent as possible, each word coming out like a sharp blade meant to cut the ties that had formed between them. "It was a mistake, Samantha. A moment of weakness that should not have happened and will not be repeated." The words hit Samantha like physical slaps, each syllable creating a new wound in a heart that was already bleeding from a week of silence and abandonment. She had prepared herself for various possibilities during the walk to his office, from explanations about dangerous business to confessions of conflicting feelings, but she hadn't prepared herself for the cold, calculated cruelty of that rejection. There was something definitive in the way he had pronounced the word mistake, as if he was sealing both their fates with a finality that allowed no appeals or second chances. She felt tears threatening to overflow, but forced herself to maintain composure, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break before his coldness. "So I was a mistake too. All those days of protection, all those nights you spent watching, all of that was just pity." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block the pain he could hear in her voice, but when he opened them again, he forced himself to look at her directly for the first time since she had entered the office. There were contained tears in her eyes that shone like diamonds, making them even more beautiful and breaking his heart in ways he didn't know were possible. He desperately wanted to go to her, hold her face between his hands and explain that he was lying, that every word coming out of his mouth was the opposite of the truth, but he knew that would only prolong the suffering of both of them. The lie he was about to tell would be the hardest of his life, but also the most necessary if he wanted to protect her from the dangerous world surrounding her. "You don't belong in this world, Samantha, and I can't pretend you do just because I momentarily forgot who I am." Samantha felt something definitively break inside her chest with these words, a part of her soul that had begun to open for him, being brutally closed and locked. She had faced many rejections and disappointments in her life, from her parents' death to the financial difficulties that almost made her give up her studies, but she had never felt such a deep and personal pain as that one. There was something particularly cruel in having her feelings minimized, as if they were irrelevant, as if the weeks of tension and connection between them could simply be erased with a few cold words. She straightened up, gathering the fragments of her wounded dignity, and looked at Alexander with a determination that surprised them both. "You're right. I don't belong in this world, but the difference between us is that I'm not afraid to admit when I'm feeling something real." The decision to leave crystallized in Samantha's mind as an absolute certainty, a clarity that cut through the confusion and pain like a sharp blade. She didn't say anything else to Alexander, simply turned and left the office with her head held high, ignoring the curious glances from employees who had witnessed her stormy entrance. During the journey back to the apartment, she mentally planned each step of her departure, from the few clothes she would take to the letter she would leave explaining her decision. There was a strange liberation in finally taking control of her own life, after weeks of being treated like a precious doll that needed to be protected from her own choices. "If he wants me to disappear from his life, I'll make things easier for him." The letter Samantha left on the living room table was written with the same clinical precision she used for her medical studies, each word carefully chosen to convey her decision without revealing the depth of the pain she felt. She thanked him for the protection and financial favors, but made it clear that she no longer wanted any kind of help or interference in her life, that she preferred to face any danger alone rather than continue being treated as an unwanted responsibility. There was a wounded dignity in every line of the letter, a final refusal to accept crumbs of attention from someone who had made it clear that she was just an error in judgment. When she finished writing, she folded the letter carefully and left it in the center of the table, where Alexander would certainly find it. Maybe now he can have the peace he so desires. Alexander found the letter 3 hours later, when he finally gave in to the impulse to check if Samantha was safe after the confrontation in his office. He read each word in silence, feeling a growing pain spread through his chest like dark ink spreading in water. There was a finality in her writing that made him realize he had underestimated her strength and determination, that she really was capable of simply disappearing from his life if he continued pushing her away. When he finished reading, he carefully folded the letter and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, close to his heart, as if he could somehow absorb a bit of her essence through the paper. She did exactly what I wanted her to do, so why do I feel like I've lost the only thing that really mattered? For the first time in years, Alexander allowed his emotional armor to visibly crack, resting his forehead against the cold window glass and closing his eyes while trying to process the reality of a world without Samantha. There was an emptiness in the apartment that went far beyond her physical absence, as if her departure had taken away all the light and warmth that he hadn't realized existed until they disappeared. He remained in that position for long minutes, allowing himself to feel the loss completely before rebuilding the barriers that protected him from dangerous emotional connections. But even as he recomposed his mask of control, he knew that something fundamental had changed within him, that Samantha had left a permanent mark on his soul that would never be completely erased. I did the right thing by letting her go, but why does it feel like I've made the biggest mistake of my life? In the days that followed, Alexander maintained his discreet surveillance over Samantha, ensuring she was safe while respecting her decision to no longer want his direct protection. He watched her from afar through reports from his men, knowing she had returned to her small old apartment and resumed her routine of studies and work as if nothing had changed. There was something admirably resilient in the way she had rebuilt her independent life, but Alexander could tell through the small details reported by his observers that she wasn't completely well. She worked long hours, avoided social contact, and there was a sadness in her movements that his men, trained to notice details, didn't fail to mention in their reports. She's moving on exactly as I wanted, so why doesn't this give me any satisfaction? Samantha desperately tried to rebuild the life she had before Alexander appeared like a storm and transformed everything, but she discovered that some changes were too permanent to simply be undone. She moved back to her small old apartment, returned to her waitressing job to pay the bills, and resumed her studies with a fierce determination that impressed her classmates. In the quiet nights when she tried to study, she found herself remembering the smell of fresh coffee that awaited her every morning, and especially the intensity of that kiss that had changed everything between them. I should be relieved to have my freedom back, but why do I feel so lost? The pattern established in the following weeks was painfully predictable. Samantha lived her independent life during the day, pretending she had completely overcome the strange period in which she had been protected by a powerful and mysterious man, while Alexander continued watching from afar, ensuring her safety without ever coming close enough to be noticed. Neither attempted direct contact, both too proud to admit that the separation had been a mistake, but also too aware of each other's constant presence to completely move on. She closed the door of the empty apartment, and he didn't try to stop her but remained standing across the street like an invisible guardian. 2 weeks had passed since Samantha returned to her previous life, and she was beginning to believe she could really forget Alexander and move on when the men in dark suits appeared at the public hospital where she worked as a nurse. They didn't seem violent, but there was a cold determination in their eyes that made Samantha's blood freeze in her veins when they asked for her at reception. She was organizing medications in the storage room when a colleague came running, whispering that strange men were looking for her and that perhaps it would be better for her to leave through the back exit. Samantha's heart raced when she realized that her decision to live independently had put not only her, but also innocent people in danger. Alexander was right about the risks, and now other people might get hurt because of me. Samantha tried to leave discreetly through the emergency exit, but found more men waiting for her in the hallway, blocking any escape route she might have considered. There was a cold politeness in the way they addressed her, explaining that they needed a private conversation and that it would be better for everyone if she cooperated without making a fuss. She could hear the normal movement of the hospital continuing around her, patients being attended to, and doctors making their rounds, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding in the secondary corridors. The irony of being surrounded by hundreds of people and yet completely vulnerable didn't go unnoticed by Samantha. If something happens to me here, Alexander won't even know until it's too late. It was in this moment of growing desperation that Samantha heard the familiar voice echoing through the corridor, a presence she had tried to forget, but that her heart recognized immediately. Alexander appeared at the end of the corridor with the same imposing posture she remembered, but there was something different in his eyes, an urgency she had never seen before. He wasn't accompanied by a security team or showing any sign of aggression. Instead, he walked calmly toward the group with his hands visible and an expression suggesting he had come to negotiate, not to fight. When his eyes met Samantha's across the corridor, she saw a mixture of relief and something that seemed almost like panic. "You came." The negotiation that followed happened in low and professional tones, with Alexander offering something that the men clearly considered valuable in exchange for Samantha's definitive safety. She couldn't hear all the details of the conversation, but she could tell from everyone's body language that Alexander was willing to make significant sacrifices to resolve the situation without violence. There was a deadly calm in the way he conducted the negotiation, as if he were playing chess with pieces worth human lives, but Samantha could see the tension in his shoulders that revealed how much this was costing him. When the men finally agreed and departed, leaving Samantha and Alexander alone in the silent corridor, she realized he had risked everything to protect her. "You would have given everything for me, even after I left." Alexander approached her slowly, as if fearing she might disappear again if he moved too quickly, and Samantha could see that the past weeks had taken a toll on him too. There were lines of fatigue around his eyes that weren't there before, a constant tension suggesting sleepless nights and worries he carried alone. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she remembered, stripped of the calculated coldness he had used as armor during their last encounter. "I couldn't let something happen to you, even knowing you no longer want my protection." Samantha felt tears burning her eyes when she realized the depth of the sacrifice Alexander had made, not just that day, but during all the weeks he had respected her decision to leave while continuing to ensure her safety from afar. There was a quiet nobility in his dedication that contrasted drastically with the cold, calculating image he projected to the world, and she finally understood that his coldness had always been a way to protect her, not reject her. She took a step toward him, reducing the space between them for the first time in weeks, and could see the surprise and hope that flashed in his dark eyes. "You never stopped protecting me, even when I said I didn't want it." The conversation that followed in Alexander's penthouse was different from any they had before, stripped of wounded pride and cutting words they had used as weapons against their own feelings. Samantha sat in the same armchair where she had found him that first night, but now the dynamic between them had fundamentally changed, based not on power or protection, but on a mutual vulnerability that both were finally willing to acknowledge. Alexander remained standing near the window, but his gaze was focused on her, not the city below, as if she were the only view that truly mattered. "This time, I want the choice to be truly yours, without pressure, without fear, just what you really desire." Alexander spoke about the last few days with a raw honesty that Samantha had never heard from his lips before, admitting that he had lied when he said the kiss had been a mistake, that every cruel word he had uttered in his office had been a desperate attempt to protect her from a world that could destroy her. There were unshed tears in his voice when he confessed that he couldn't live knowing she was in danger, but that he also couldn't force her anymore to accept a protection she didn't want. He promised that if she chose to leave again, he would respect her decision completely, but that he would never stop ensuring her safety, even if she never knew about it. "If you want a normal life away from me, I'll make sure you have that option, even if it means never seeing you again." Samantha listened to every word in silence, her heart breaking and healing simultaneously, as she finally understood the depth of the feelings Alexander had hidden behind his mask of coldness. There was a generosity in his love that went far beyond physical protection, a willingness to sacrifice his own happiness to ensure she was free to make her own choices. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm but laden with emotion, and she could see the impact of her words on his expression. "I don't want a normal life if it means a life without you." Samantha's confession broke the last barrier between them, and Alexander crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping only when he was close enough for her to feel the heat emanating from his body. There were tears in his eyes that he didn't try to hide, a vulnerability she had never seen in him before, and when he raised his hands to touch her face, his fingers trembled slightly. They stayed like this for long moments, simply looking at each other, as if seeing each other for the first time, free from the complications and misunderstandings that had separated them. "I've loved you since that first night, but I was too afraid to admit it." The kiss that followed was different from their first on the porch, not charged with desperation and repressed passion, but soft and full of promises for the future. Samantha could feel the difference in the way Alexander held her, not with the desperate possessiveness of someone who feared losing something, but with the secure tenderness of someone who had finally found his place in the world. When they parted, they remained with their foreheads touching, breathing the same air and sharing the same space, as if they were 2 parts of a whole that had finally reunited. This time it's forever. 6 months later, Samantha was working in a private clinic specialized in providing free care to underserved communities, a project Alexander had discreetly financed, but which she managed with complete independence. She had maintained her identity and her professional dreams, but now had the necessary resources to make a real difference in the lives of people who most needed medical care. Alexander continued his business, but there was a fundamental change in his priorities, a humanity he had found through love that he no longer needed to hide. They had found a way to unite their worlds without either of them having to sacrifice who they really were. "We've created something new together, something that is ours." Samantha was reviewing medical records in her office when she felt the familiar presence that still made her heart race even after months of shared happiness. Alexander appeared at the door with that smile she had learned to recognize as exclusively hers, an expression he reserved only for moments when they were alone. He approached her desk with the same elegance as always, but now there was a lightness in his movements that didn't exist before, as if the weight of carrying his feelings alone had finally been removed from his shoulders. When he extended his hand to her, Samantha took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining naturally and perfectly. "Ready to go home?" They walked together toward the elevator, and Samantha realized how her life had transformed in surprising ways, not through dramatic changes, but through small moments of connection and choices made out of love instead of fear. Alexander had learned to lower his emotional defenses, and she had learned that accepting love and protection didn't mean losing her independence. They had found a balance that worked for both of them, based on mutual respect and a deep understanding of each other's needs and desires. When the elevator doors closed, Alexander pulled Samantha into his arms and she fit perfectly against his chest, as if she had been made to be there. He held her hand against his chest, where his heart beat only for her like someone who would never let go. Did you enjoy Samantha and Alexander's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.